Welcome to a brief introduction of segmentation. It's meant as a recap of your textbook's chapter on this subject. So please read your textbook first, and then this will make a lot more sense. Okay, so segmentation is the first part of this three-step process called segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And you could argue it's the most critical part because if you don't get your segmentation right, the rest of the process becomes pretty worthless. So in the first step, we segment the total market. Step 2, targeting, is where we actually decide what segment to go after. Step 3 is where we try to position ourselves in the minds of the consumer with a competitive advantage. All right, so here's a definition of segmentation, one of many definitions. Market segmentation is the process of dividing the total heterogeneous market into several segments, each of which tends to be homogeneous in all significant aspects to each other and heterogeneous to those in other segments. So what this means in plain English is that we want you to identify the total market, every potential consumer or business, if you're doing B2B segmentation, that are in this market. And then you slice up this market into segments of consumers or businesses that are similar in their main defining criteria, but also different from the other segments. So if you have a major overlap between two segments, you might actually want to merge them together and just treat them as one segment. Another thing that makes this process a bit tricky is that all segments must be measurable. So we can assess each segment for its size and growth and profit potential. We want to know exactly how many consumers or how many businesses, if we're in the B2B space, are in each segment, and what is the potential turnover in that segment. Another important point here is that the segmentation part is all about the market. It's not about the company yet. So two competitors can theoretically segment the market exactly the same way. And this is where the second step, the targeting part, becomes really critical, because you might not want to go after the same segment that your main competitor is. Here's a brief step-by-step guide. Step 1 is defining the market. What market are we actually in? What are the boundaries? Who's in and who's out? Step 2 would be analyzing the total market potential. Before we start slicing up the market into segments, we want to know what's the total market worth. This is where you'd look for data. Maybe MarketLine has already calculated the estimated sales in this market in 2020 in your country, or maybe you'll have to calculate it yourself. Step 3, what are the most relevant segmentation criteria that distinguish each segment from each other? Where is it that consumers or businesses differ? Is it in their needs, choice criteria, lifestyle? Step 4, now you build the actual segmentation table. Typically you'd have 2 or 3 segmentation criteria that you build this table upon. And then afterwards, if there are, for example, 2 age groups that are actually the same segment, when you sort of analyze their behavior, then you can collapse some cells in your table. But I'll demonstrate this in the cases. And finally, we recommend that you name your segments to make it more explicit what each segment is all about. Here are the typical segmentation criteria in a consumer market, B2C. And we would normally say that the behavioral criteria to your left, benefits sought, purchase occasion, usage, perceptions, that those are the most critical ones. If we want to target a consumer base, we want to target our products or services towards their specific needs and behavior. However, since we're also asking you to quantify each segment, you would probably also need to look to your right and consider some profile data, demographics, geographics, because these are things that you could look up in Statistics Denmark and get some numbers to work with. B2B segmentation has a very similar approach, only with a slight difference. We still define the market, analyze the total market potential, but then we sort of segment twice. First, we do macro segmentation based on some macro factors that I'll show you in a minute. Then we do more specific micro segmentation, and then we still name our segments at the end. So macro segmentation would be looking at organizational size or industry or geographical location. So after having done the macro segmentation, we might focus on particular industries or companies of a certain size. And then we'll take that macro segment into micro segmentation and segment deeper on choice criteria, decision-making unit, buy class, etc. And finally, here's an example of what it could look like when you've sliced up the entire market. In this case, it's the Danish car industry that I'll show you in a case video how to develop. So here we have 6 segments, 6 B2C segments in Denmark. Anything from city singles to car lovers. Very measurable segments here. We know exactly how many households are in each segment and what's the potential revenue, and that makes the targeting part easier. Now it's made for Ford, but as you can see, it's got nothing to do with Ford yet. This is the market. Toyota and Volvo might look at the market completely the same way. So the next part becomes interesting, which is the targeting part. So which segment do you go after in this market? Do you go after the one that's got the highest revenue potential, or the one with the highest growth, or the one that looks the least competitive, or the one that matches your products or services the best? That's the decision that needs to be made. We would also recommend, after having selected a segment, that you build what we call a persona around that segment, which means building a prototype of your customer. What is the typical customer of this product? Male or female, age, media habits, consumer behavior in general, decision-making process, customer journey, all this type of stuff. Put some more details on your segment. That will make it a lot easier when you get to marketing mix decisions at a later stage. And finally, here we have positioning, which of course should be linked to your segmentation and targeting. So the identified needs or main choice criteria, whatever it might be, you've identified for your segment. Of course, that's what you want to build your competitive advantage around. You don't want to position yourselves on criteria that the consumer doesn't care about. So all of these 3 steps, STP, are connected.